So, hello everyone. If anyone is to all people who are logged into our second live session, my name is Henry Sullivan. I'm the author of Colosseum and the Council of Nobles trilogy, and I'm in conversation with Christine.
Hi, and I'm Christine Madera. I am the author of God and Drag, and I'm really happy to be here. It's fun to talk with you, Henry, because we both have some really kind of overlapping, interesting views of the world.
Yes, we do. So, the last time we talked about it's a quote that actually goes, "The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon."
Hmm.
And I was introduced to that quote by Christine, but I amended it a little bit to "The finger pointing at America is not America." We had a discussion about that. Our discussion this week is about inalienable rights, the idea that human beings have rights that are by virtue of being human, that are not granted by governments, constitutions, or a god. So that's what we will be talking about today. So, Christine, what are some of your thoughts about the idea of, I guess I should start by saying I've recently heard a discussion about that and I was inspired by it, but I guess the cynical side of me kind of felt like I'm skeptical whether or not it's still an inspiring idea, the idea that all human beings have rights by virtue of being human. So I guess my first question to you is, what do you think about that? Do you think that I'm just being overly cynical or
Well, it's not hard to be overly cynical these days, but I do think actually because we're moving toward more cynicism, that an idea that we have inalienable rights separate from governments and gods and that
Mhm.
kind of stuff is actually even more inspiring because it gives us a different paradigm to begin to look toward for maybe whatever is next as, all of this chaos is underway and beginning to disintegrate. We need to build what our next phase is on something, and I think building it on the idea of inalienable rights is not a bad one. And so it'll be interesting to see if that inspires more people to think about it that way. But no, I think it's actually more inspiring the more cynical that we get.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I love about the idea of rights by virtue of being human, number one, it just makes sense to me. But I'm a civic minded person, and I think one of the things that we talked about 2 weeks ago is that it feels to me like being civic minded and being ideological in the political sense is a subculture in our country, at least. It's not a general thing. Although I have been kind of inspired though. It does seem as though after all these years of just information messaging about like rights and freedoms and all that kind of stuff that people may not be able to articulate. They may not even be able to come up with the quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Now, if you shove a microphone in people's faces, they may not be able to come up with that right off of the top of
Right.
their head. But at the same time, when you drive up on into a neighborhood with a mask on, jump out of your car and grab somebody, people do feel like they have a right to like the person you grabbed has rights, regardless
Hmm.
of whether you claim to
Yeah.
be authority or not. And people feel like they're entitled to speak out against that. And so like that sentiment is very common in our society, even if the actual phrase is not as commonly known. You see what I'm saying?
And the phrase itself, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, are a little amorphous to really lock yourself around. And people will call on them for different things. And actually, I think the original before it got changed to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was life, liberty, and property. So
Mm,
because we had this very reactionary group of people who didn't want England to be able to take their property, and the property rights of kings were very specific, and the
mhm.
property rights of non-kings were to basically you served at the pleasure of the king. And so for people to have their own property was a big deal, but then that was kind of voted down, I guess, and pursuit of happiness was put in there because it was broader than property. So, those were some ideas that people had that were kind of inspiring at the time, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, they tried to create some laws and stuff around that. But we've been sort of calling on that ever since then. And we have different ideas, I think, we talk about America a lot, different ideas in America about what is life, what is liberty, and what is the pursuit of happiness. And so we kind of argue over what those rights are, even if we have a phrase.
Well, I'm sort of smiling because that pursuit of happiness one to me is another reason why the having as a basis, we all have rights by virtue of being human makes sense as well. Because one person's happiness may actually be another person's,
Hmm.
So in other words, the thing that makes you happy might be obscene to somebody else.
Right, and I think that's very valid, and, I think that the tension point between that is when one person's happiness begins to infringe upon another person's happiness. So, like, if my happiness requires that you be unhappy or that I have control over you in some way so that you are, I can control what your happiness is, I can control your actions, I can control this, or I'm some way harming you. If your pursuit of happiness is harming somebody else, then I think
Mhm.
that's sort of that line that pursuit of happiness is not really, um, not so much that it's not valid, but it is not part of inalienable rights because those rights infringe upon somebody else's inalienable right. So I think it's that area in between where, your rights and my rights, if we don't agree on what we want to do, at least can exist without infringing upon one another or infringing upon anybody else.
I mean, I agree with you, but the thing is it seems as though we always seem to have this group of people who talk as if they've been somehow put upon, but
Mhm.
when you really investigate what their grievance is, it's
Uh-huh.
all about what someone else is able to do, how someone else is behaving, and they just
Mhm.
feel like I shouldn't have to exist with the knowledge that someone else is existing in this way. Because I mean,
Right.
the truth is,
Yeah.
it's just like if you don't want to see it, you can always turn off the channel,
That's
turn away
right.
from that YouTube channel or whatever.
Yeah.
But these are people who, in addition to being offended by this thing, they fixate on it. So it might
Yes.
actually be the thing, like their relatives are kind of tired of them talking about it because whenever they
Mhm.
see them, it's like, "Hey, Grandma, how you doing? Have you seen that boy over there?" It's just like, I mean, it could be
Yeah.
the thing that they always think about and talk about. And it's just sort of like, God, why is it they won't stop talking about this one thing? And so again, I feel like having the idea that, well, I mean, they're human and they're not, like, as you say, infringing upon anybody else's rights,
Mhm.
then they have a right to do that. And you can always just mind your own business.
That's right. Because there's all kinds of stuff that go on that we don't know about.
Right.
So, just if you're fixating on something, that's really your personal issue that you need to, like, let it go and focus on the things that you like. I mean, that's kind of its personality trait. It's an emotion trait, that you have to, it's that outrage trait, it's kind of that outrage addiction that we have. And,
Hmm.
it's that I need to fixate on something because it gives me energy. It makes me feel powerful. I need an enemy, all of that kind of stuff. I mean, ideally, oh my god, aren't we, like, over that? I mean, it's certainly we can get beyond 2nd grade, and
Oh,
begin to
no.
redirect our own attention to the things that we wanna pay attention to and we wanna increase more of instead of the things that we want to, fight and control and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah, and I'm a little bit, I know you're a civic-minded person and a political person. I'm more of a system person. So, like, when we
Mm,
brought up or you brought up the idea of that we all have inalienable rights by virtue of being human that aren't given to us by God or governments or anything like that. Like, I immediately go to, okay, how do we create a system that actually starts from there?
okay.
And so I am less interested in fixing the system that we have and more interested in looking at things like, if we had a common value in humanity that we all have rights and we have a sense of what those rights are, how do we build from the ground up a society and a global society where, everybody has those rights and can build up around those rights? I mean, that's kind of fun for me. So is exactly where my mind goes. Like, it goes less to, how do we express that in today's world and more like, how do we create a new world?
Well, as it happened, I have a strong feeling that you will have a once in a lifetime opportunity.
I a lot of people talking about that, so maybe that would be true.
to create a system from scratch. So what do you think? Like, how do you have you thought about that? Like, what kind of system
Yeah.
can you envision? Okay, so hit
Well,
me
and
with it.
it's not, from this quote particularly. I During COVID, we're all on lockdown and stuff like that. I have this little neighborhood that I live in, and I didn't have work or anything like that, so I'd walk around my neighborhood a lot, and I had this character that had kept coming to me as a fiction writer, and the idea that I'm like, "I will work with you, but I need a better idea, like, I need an idea that I'm interested in." And it was really kind of a near future, um speculative fiction thing that where we had actually already created a new world. And it was
Mhm,
the functioning of that new world. And then there's, of course, there were things that happened and blah, blah, blah. I don't want to go into the story, and it's a series. So it's hard because you got to kind of plot the whole series. I walked around for 6 months because walking is one of the ways that I can really think. And I'm like, how can you create a different world? Like, and then it came to, well, what are the values that a world is created around? I mean, currently what's really about profit, power, domination, control, the whole paradigm, right?
mhm,
And
mm.
so I'm like, okay, so what are some other, and money and capitalism and all this kind of stuff. And so I thought, well, okay, so what other value systems can we use? And the value system that came up as the core value system was personal and collective well-being. If we built a system around personal and collective well-being, and so then for the next 4 months, I'm walking around like, how would that work? What would that look like? How might that be? And how could that work as a global system without infringing upon anybody, that allows everybody to be fed, allows everybody to be housed, allows everybody to contribute, and allows everybody to be supported and give healthcare and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of created this fantasy world that was really kind of fun. And so hopefully at some point that series will come out and I can lay out my how this world unfolded for me as I was walking around. Because what I realized when I was doing that is, if the incentives that we have in a society and the values that power that society create the society that we have. And so our current values are really destroying us on many different ways. And if we had a new set of values and we were creating around that new set of values, what would happen if you actually create from a set of values intentionally, designing for not incorruptibility? Because our founders tried to design for incorruptibility, didn't really
Mhm.
work, but for inspiring and incentivizing people to operate from their best self.
So, when you say the values we currently have, would greed is good be a good example of a reflection of what you're seeing as the values that we currently have? You remember that, right? Greed is good?
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Michael Douglas, yeah. Green is good. Yeah, so and that's sort of an expression of it, but I mean, if you look at our the incentives and the core values that we operate around, the core values are domination, profit, or greed. Me, myself, and I, disregarding you. As long as I get mine, it doesn't matter what anybody else has. Like, it's really about that selfishness. It's about, me being in it for me. And that if I can dominate you, more the better, because that will, help me. And the incentives that we have around profit and power. I mean, that's, if you look at it, you see these people in AI and stuff saying, we need to be stopped. We need to be taxed. We need to be, we need guardrails. But because without global guardrails, the incentive of profit will drive us to destruction. And they are saying that out loud.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so that profit incentive, because that's our incentive, profit and power, we can all see it. But how can we change the incentive so that we have a different outcome?
Now, how do you square that? I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying in terms of people in power, but how do you square that with what we're seeing in Minneapolis, where people are totally going out and sacrificing themselves for people
Yeah.
that they didn't necessarily know? How do you square the one with the other?
Well, I think that that is the best of human nature. I mean, to me, that is when push comes to shove. And I live in Asheville, North Carolina. I
Mhm.
was, like, ground zero for Hurricane Helene, and
Okay.
so when we had no electricity, when we had no internet, when we have no phone service, when we had no water, all this stuff, like,
Mhm.
everybody pitches in. Everybody brings forward that community spirit, like, everybody steps into that best version of themselves as good as they can in the moment, and things begin to work from there, because I think that is the nature of the human spirit. But when we layer over that incentives like greed and profit and power, then you get people who are really interested in those incentives who create systems around that that drive more power and profit and that kind of stuff, domination to the smaller and smaller group of people. But the systems revolve around that. And so even in our everyday lives, our systems are designed to make us, need and want more money, need and want to beat other people out so that we have what we need. That sort of suppresses the best of human nature rather than allows the best of human nature. But in Minneapolis, when, we come into that place where we see our friends and our neighbors and are being terrorized basically, then we respond in that same way people did in the middle of tragedy here, is that like everything else falls away. Nobody asked here what your politics were. Nobody cared. It's that we have this problem and we're going to get together and solve this problem. And that's what they were doing in Minneapolis. That's what I think humanity is designed to do, is to come together as communities. But the systems that we're in drive our larger behaviors because of the way that they set us against each other.
So, okay, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. So it sounds like what you're saying is that on the one hand, you believe human beings are naturally inclined to be
For the most part, yes.
good, exactly, to behave in good ways and be cooperative and compassionate and all that kind of stuff. But the system that we have constructed, or the system that we find ourselves in, is basically discouraging that natural inclination. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
If we have if it and if you think about like incentives and how we incentivize things. Like if you think about the Super Bowl, so I would always every year for a while, and nobody paid any attention, would write a re-release article about how the Super Bowl is really a celebration of cooperation. Because even though we celebrate the competition, we have 4 hours of competition, and then you have to put a show in there. But we have hundreds of hours of cooperation within a
Mhm.
team being able to get to that level of competition. And we
Mhm.
kinda, like, poo-poo all of that. But you look at any business, you look at almost anything that we do, the military, all that, it is mostly, like, 95% cooperation and 5% competition. We have just elevated the competition to something that we revere, and we kinda poo-poo the cooperation as, like, woke or something. Some kind of, "Oh, no, we can't cooperate because, that's just not what we do." But almost everything is about cooperation. You can't build a building without cooperation. You can't have a sports team without cooperation. You can't have a business without cooperation. The stock market doesn't work without cooperation. Everything is built on cooperation, and yet we ignore it and we incentivize competition.
So, okay, so does your system favor one economic aspect over another economic aspect? So in other words, does it make more sense in your system, because capitalism versus socialism, those are economic structures. Those aren't really political structures. And so does your system favor capitalism or socialism? I mean, those are
Neither.
the two that are
No,
neither.
oh my god, those are, like, so last century. Why do we even talk about those things? Good lord. We have so many better things. We're blockchain now. We could create all kinds of new stuff. You could have
Okay.
global voting via blockchain. You can have, no, this is really more like there's really not nations in the sense that we have nations. Like there might be Olympics or something, but there's not governance from top down. There's governance through what's called projects. So instead of having like an agricultural industry, there was this food project, and and it was all online basically, and it's a different internet than we have now. It's not full of bots, but it was like these projects would work with each other around from places from around the world and help to solve problems, because of course there's still climate change and all these adaptations that we need to make. And so these projects would begin to work together. So you got the transportation project working on how does transportation transportation work around the world in various different situations, and the foods project, and all these different kinds of things. And that those projects, because they are the how the world is running, have their own elected leaders and work together in a similar way of like United Nations, but not quite like that. Because those projects are cooperative and you have to actually connect with other projects to get anything done, it is really a people up process. So there is hierarchy because you can't, like, not everybody can operate in every single decision, but you can have collective decision making if you have a blockchain type of technology where people are actually really interacting on what's happening in their lives on a regular basis versus every 2 years or every 4 years having an election. So this was really, and I have they operate, it's a long, involved sort of thing. So, but there was an idea that this guy whose name I can't remember was talking about, and other people have talked about it as too, as a time that if you work for your local community, so this is the basics of it. If you work for your local community, 10, 15, 20 hours a week, depending on what your local community required. And then within that, you got your housing, you got your education, you got your health care, you got all of your basic needs were met. And you had this time dividend to spend doing other things. So you might like another project that you wanted to do, and you can get other things, other forms of remuneration for these other projects. But you contribute to community, all of your basic needs are met. You're involved in a couple of different projects. You can be more involved if you want to, less involved if you want to. But that, your interaction wasn't dictated from the top down or by, I have to earn this much of this to do this. It was more about community interaction, and I'm part of this community, and my needs are met because I am part of this community. And communities then kind of interlayer and become larger and larger so that they're more of a, an interlocking system. But everything is run really from the bottom up rather than the top down, and much more community oriented in terms of you being connected to your immediate physical community and also to the world through larger and other communities. I haven't really got it down to like a little sentence or a paragraph I can explain it, but I'll work on that.
Well, I have a couple of different ways of sort of tossing this idea around, to see exactly what comes out of it. One thing that occurs to me is I'm just thinking about my own life. I grew up in New Orleans. I graduated from Xavier University at the end of the 80s. I went from there to Columbus, Ohio for law school for a year. Kind of envision your community thing in terms of that. So I guess I went from a small Black university community, to an extremely large state university community, the
Mhm.
graduate school in that community. So I mean, I guess there is sort of still sort of holds true. But then, I hated law school because I'm an idealistic person.
Oh, yeah, that'd be hard.
And a person who kinda liked to party in the same way I did said, "I think you'll love Chicago." She was absolutely right. And so I went from what felt like a boring, constraining, kinda community in the law school community at Ohio State to an extremely enjoyable, community in Chicago with house music and blues and jazz, and barbecue and stuff like that. So, but I'm trying to envision if the country were the way you're describing, how would I go from those communities? Because I mean, I've done that a lot in my life.
Mhm.
I've gone from one community, I mean, from Hyde Park in Chicago to Oak Park, from Oak Park to, I spent some time in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Phoenix, Arizona, you know, a bunch of different places. And so, how does that work? So, I mean, are people just welcomed into these new communities? How are they connected?
I imagine there'd be a mechanism, like, there's a mechanism now, even though we think about you can move anywhere, but you have to have the money to move there, you have to be able to find a place to live, like, there's still constraints when you move to a different place, but no, I imagine that you could move around in different communities, and I hadn't gotten to where people were doing that so much because this is a YA novel, so it's more the teenage level, so they're not
I
really
got you.
moving out to other communities, so a little bit different than that.
Okay.
But no, I think there'd have to be a mechanism for things like that because people like to move, they like to try new things, and if you're not really into your community, being able to find another community, I think, is a natural thing. But how this kind of worked is not, I hate to use the, like, social credit, like, because the Chinese do that, and that's very top-down kind of control system, but, a credit system that, you do your 15 hours of credit for your basic needs, and then, you've got other ways that you can interact for more resources to do other things, including potentially moving around, traveling, all of that kind of stuff. And I imagine in a community just like now, if you were going to move into a community, like you moved to Chicago, you had to find some way to contribute to Chicago because Chicago was certainly helping you. So, I think there'd be a little different mechanism for that kind of stuff, but I think it would almost have to be, it would have to be, in my world, it would be possible. I just
Okay.
haven't, and I've thought about that, but I haven't, just in the age group that I was working with, it wasn't really in a contained world. It wasn't as, I wasn't thinking about this in terms of our world permanently. I was thinking this in terms of my book, but
Okay.
yes, there's that mechanism. And in the book, there are certain ways of doing that that were easier, and I hadn't really explored, like, if I just wanted to go move somewhere else, what would I do?
Well, the other thing that occurred to me is, are you familiar with the network state concept coming out of the techno oligarchs? Are you familiar with that idea?
I heard something about that quite a little while ago, but tell me more and let's talk about it.
So the idea, I mean, they love the fact that you brought up blockchain,
Uh-huh.
and stuff like that because that's exactly what they're thinking. I mean, in fact, apparently Jeffrey Epstein was basically talking about that in his emails in very very poor grammar, but still, those are the things that he was discussing.
Uh-huh.
And so, like the idea of a network state, it's almost like you have these corporate structures, sort of entities
Mhm.
where, it's a city, but it's not really a city that's connected to a country in a way that like Phoenix, Arizona is part of county in the state of Arizona in the country of the United States of America. It's not really like that. It's more like company X's
Right.
city.
Country is government. I mean, corporation is country, corporation is government. So it's still
Yeah,
top
it's
down,
government,
it's
exactly.
still controlled, it's still, and I think that's the mechanism that's the problem. Like, we have wonderful emerging technology, and you can
Mhm,
use it for something that supports inalienable rights and, the humanity of all beings and supporting the well-being of everybody on the planet, or you can use it to dominate and control. It's like money. You can use money for wonderful things. You can use money to really hurt people.
mhm,
So money in and of itself is just a technology basically
mhm,
that we can use in different ways. And the same thing, like blockchain really just allows us to have transparent transactions on a large scale and have those tracked through a blockchain. But you can use that for global voting for wonderful things, or you can use that to control everybody. But it's just the intention behind the use. So I have like that whole network state thing, like the government control. No, not into that. But the technology can be used another way.
okay. So how do you incentivize innovation in a community like that? Because it seems to me like that's one of the challenges for the much older communities over on the other side of the Atlantic is
Hmm.
that, they have what to us look like really strong social network, social states, like supporting the citizens in
Hmm.
ways that, some Americans find obscene, to be frank with you. But on the other hand, they don't seem to be very strong in terms of the innovation side of things. They're not like reveling in creative destruction and all this other nonsense. So, I mean, how do you generate innovation in your community, or does it stay pretty basic? In other words,
No,
does
I
it
think
stay
it's, not in my, like I said, not in my book series, no, there's actually they're, moving into galactic exploration. So
really?
it is, yeah, I mean, it's a very, but it's the incentives to get there are different. And actually that's the whole premise of the series in many ways is who controls Earth's and humanity's interaction with the galactic whatever's
Hmm.
out there.
Okay.
Do we entrust it to governments and corporations?
Hmm.
Or does that interaction, and if we do that, then is humanity in service to that? Like, do we just become like a company town for whatever's happening, galactically? Or is that something that actually is something that we all benefit from and cooperate with or contribute to and benefit from, and it represents and benefits all of us versus just a few. And that was the premise of the entire series, the tension between those two things. You know, if we're interacting with space, is it humanity interacting or is it actors on humanity who might have nefarious ideas? And so innovation in my little world is actually quite a bit of it is done through there's a particular platform, I can go into all that, but you can do it like a simulated manufacturing, and it's sort of a, what do they call it? Open source. And
Mhm,
so different people have different projects or different groups are working on different projects, and they can do quite a bit of that, you know,
mhm.
virtually versus having to do it in the physical world. And your incentives within that are when you get some of the credits to be able to buy stuff and things like that. But also there's a great system and who was it that can't think of his name, wrote a book about status. Guy, he's off his name I'll pop in. And how we do, you know, we will do lots of things for status. And we've always done things for status, not just in our current society, but you think of things like I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Papua New Guinea. And they've got this big man system there where, you know, the big man who's like a chief of something, not quite in the same way that we think of the word chief. One of the ways that they get status is that they accumulate a lot and then they distribute it. So like the potlatches and Native Americans where you would have I'm hearing a feedback, but you would have chiefs basically who would, in our terms, bankrupt themselves because of the status of being able to give things and food and things like that to other people, and that's how they got status. People pursue status in lots of different ways and not necessarily
Uh,
ways that would benefit us. And so status is a big driver and it always has been. So if you can incentivize through, you know, the status of participating in something that's being created, just a status of having your name attached to it, that you know that you can incentivize something like that, that it is doesn't give you control over anybody else, but it elevates you personally. You know, so that is one kind of incentive you can give to innovation. And then a lot of people, I mean, we're a creative species. We love to create. And so if you find your niche group and your niche interest in creating something, you know, just the by virtue of being involved in that, that gives you something that you really enjoy doing that can also give you credits and things like that, but that drive innovation. So if you look at a lot of the stuff, look at YouTube. I mean, most of YouTube, before it became the platform everybody used to try to make money, it was this amazing platform of people doing creative things for fun and putting it out there and just for fun and in sort of an interactive space. So I think we are highly creative, inventive beings. And just by virtue of being in a collaborative process, especially with other people and something that we believe in, and open source is a great platform for that because there's a lot of people who really love the open source model and give hours and hours of their time to it for nothing. You know, so we already have that internal incentive to create, but we may just not have the okay, I lost my train of thought there. So anyway, we've got this wonderful thing. And I mean, you're talking about Europe and things like that. Their incentives for creation maybe not as high as ours because we've got a lot of ways if you start a business that you can not lose everything that you have. And so being able to drive your innovation in particular ways here is easier than driving your innovation in particular ways in over across the pond. So we get more people who are more innovative here just because of the way it's structured.
well, you know, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that in terms of money, in terms
Mhm.
of like, you know, the resource that you need to live for the basics. So food, shelter, you know,
Mhm.
transportation, the resource that you need for the
Okay. Yeah.
basics. It sounds to me like your system ties that to your physical participation in a particular way in your community. So that resource is generated in terms of points that you get when you participate in the community in a very particular way, in a physical way. So that's the one side of it, and then the other side of it, the creativity. So you kind of you've eliminated the rat race,
Yeah.
actually.
Basically, yeah, because I don't like the rat race, so why would I wanna create that in a book?
Yeah, you've eliminated the rat race, and so there isn't nearly as much of an incentive, like you know that dilemma that's being talked about nowadays, where there was a period when you know Wall Street banks and whatnot were going in and sort of, especially not so much the banks, especially the not so much the hedge funds either, the consulting firms like Goldman Sachs and stuff like that were going to Ivy League schools and saying, "Yeah, I understand that you want to do good and help the world, and we have all these problems, but we do that too." You
Mhm.
know, and why not make a decent
Make a lot of
salary
money for
while
that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, effective altruism, that type of thing, that
Mhm.
type of thinking,
Yeah.
and so, it sounds like what you're saying is if you sort of eliminate the stress and the tension that comes from just doing what you're told for specific things to earn a particular salary, regardless of what the salary may be really nice, but, kind of exchanging, the ability to travel and buy nice things with you're exchanging that for peace of mind and quiet and like community
Well,
and stuff like
and a
that.
time dividend is the big one. So if you're
Yeah.
working for a Wall Street firm, you're probably working 60 hours a week,
Or you're working you're
unless
working your
you're the
ass
top
off.
dog, you
Yeah.
know? And so in my eyes, what do people really want? And when you listen to what people really like, ordinary people, not necessarily people who like have to have 10 Lamborghinis or whatever, but if you or all the power in the world, but if you listen to what people really want, they want time. They want time to spend with their friends. They want time to do what they want to do. And this whole drive of having to, make enough money right now, making enough money to have rent on an apartment. I mean,
Mhm.
these poor kids coming out of college that don't have any jobs. And so, and then these older people, like in our era of the greed is good, always going to the bigger house and the flashier stuff and, your statuses and being able to have the better whatever than your neighbor has. If you can have a time dividend, like if you can have all of your needs met, and what I people talk about a universal basic income, but in my system, it's a universal basic standard of living that, every community has a different one because your standard of living starting out in one place is going to be, like in
Right.
rural India is probably going to be different than it is in, suburban Ohio or something. But within that system, you've got your universal basic standard of living and that's kind of the place that you start from and then you build on top of that. But if you have, I mean, so you could potentially do your 15 hours a week, have your basic standard of living, and spend the rest of your time playing video games if you want to. But
Mhm.
most people are more interested in something else besides just laying around. They're into gardening or they're into some kind of hobby or they're into something that captivates their interest and they want to spend more time doing that kind of stuff than they would wanting to push some paper somewhere to be able to earn more money, to be able to, buy something so that they can do their hobby. So you sort of eliminate that 10 steps from here to here.
Okay. I mean, I guess what I'm sort of imagining though, like if you can get I think people are actually experimenting with communities like that right
They are.
now. I mean,
Yeah,
but
they are.
their motivations may be very different from your motivation though.
Oh, yeah, and I get to
But
create a world from scratch in my novel, so I started from,
that's
like,
true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. You get to
something
live there
new.
in your head.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, if you try to, I think, like I said, I think people are actually trying to implement stuff like this right
they are.
now.
Yeah.
And, I'm just trying to imagine with a situation like that, if you manage to do it in some small town in almost I mean, every state in the US has small towns. So it doesn't really matter which state, as long as it's a small town that's sort of isolated from the metropolitan areas. What you could wind up with is a little community, fewer than 10,000 people or something like that. All of the really advanced stuff that you want, that someone in your community might want would actually be stuff that you have to import from other places.
Mhm.
So, I mean, are you saying that you can create this little community and have this, be technologically sustainable? Or you sort of accept that reality that you're sort of trading off one thing for the other in a way?
Well, so in my little world, the whole world has moved to this system. There was like a global blockchain vote and everybody voted to move to this system. And so it's sort of everything moved at the same time. And then they created that from the ground up. So a little bit different than trying to drop that down, into our system as we have now as an isolated community.
Do you remember this thing that happened? I think this was around 2015 when there was I think it was a dress. And the whole question was, is the dress blue or is
Uh-huh.
it green?
Yeah, blue or gold, I think. It's blue or
Well,
gold.
yeah, but,
Yeah,
like, within, like, a couple of
mhm,
hours, this controversy and it became clear that some people are gonna see one color and other people are gonna see another color, and that's a really
yeah,
basic thing. So, the
yeah.
idea that all these different parts of the world are gonna agree to do one thing.
Well, so it was less about everybody doing the same thing and more about switching from a system of governments and corporations and top-down power to communities and interconnection and bottom-up power. Like there was choosing between two different structural systems.
Does
So,
that
but the
follow
way that
does that follow a catastrophe? Like, does that follow something where
It follows a critical incident, but not necessarily like it's not like, there's an apocalypse and this happens.
okay,
It's more there's a critical incident and there's the ability to make this change, and so and the critical incident has actually changed, so I would need to organize that critical incident a little bit differently.
okay,
But it is, like right now we all operate on the money financial system. The whole world operates on it, right? And so if you switch that out to operating from a different system, all of a sudden everything has to change, but every different area is going to have to implement it their own way. So it really takes it from we all have to adhere to this financial system to, we're all gonna be community based and it's gonna be something that we you create individually. So it's actually, gives you, in my view, a lot more freedom and a lot more ways to build something up from one community to another, one ethnic group to another ethnic group, one religion to another religion to, do it more individually than right now where we're very homogeneously connected to the financial system.
well, the funny thing about the war, and I know that might be a strange transition, is that what is revealing is
Uh-huh.
that we were living in more similar ways than at least I realized. Like, I had no idea there were so many digital nomads in Dubai,
Mhm.
or Riyadh, or, I mean, I had no idea that they were out there. And I mean, to the point where they're living in ways that are similar enough to Europe and the United States that when the bombs start coming, they're just like, "Hey, what's that?" And they pull out their phone and they're like showing and stuff.
Uh-huh.
Did you see that? And it's just like, "Oh my God, I just heard an explosion." I mean, and so, it's just fascinating to me how even though we do have I mean, the systems all have different names. So the assumption is that in the Holy Land, you have these theocracies. And of course, you have the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that is a very clear theocracy. But you wouldn't necessarily assume that Saudi Arabia would have some cities at
Alright,
least
you've
where
frozen
people
on
are
me.
living. Since Tehran is in the news, I think YouTube is sending me more videos where people that you may not expect or have these headlines of "I'm in Tehran." Like I saw a video. There's a black guy who did some about a year ago.
Mhm.
And so I guess on the one hand, I think the idea that like the world would never agree to sort of have a similar sort of system kind of is belied by the reality that if you look around the world, you'll see very similar systems all over the place. We just don't think of it that way. Cell phone technology, the way people are using cell phones, like you said, YouTube used to be a place where people just kind of posted all kind of stuff for fun. And now people have figured out ways to make money from posting things on YouTube. But at the same time, that's a global market in a lot of ways.
Well, so define the world then. I mean, that's, I think, where it breaks down. The world, as in the governmental world, would never agree to that.
Right.
But look at that. We are all using cell phones. We are all using similar apps. I mean, there's infrastructure that has been built that we can
Hmm.
connect with
Hmm.
and we can create from that are
There's a certain
independent of the governmental structure. So, I mean, if you think about it, there's already all kinds of
interoper
systems in place that,
interoperability. Yes, it's already
yeah,
there.
there's systems in place that we could build on to create something that is much more, I don't want to say democratized in the governmental system, but much more, democratized in the sense that we as individual humans can work together and play together and contribute to one another outside of the governmental structures that dictate our lives from country to country.
Hmm, fascinating. Okay,
Yeah.
I mean
I just think there's a couple of cards that if they got pulled might really change things, you know? So
mhm.
I have no idea. And this, the whole thing you're talking about theocracies, there was something that came out of my YouTube today, kind of out of the blue, as those things do, that was talking about how, the Great War. And so all the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and how all of their apocalyptic end stories are converging at this time, and that there are powerful forces who are really trying to live out the story, like the Armageddon story.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Oh,
so, and
absolutely.
they're
My
in charge, they're the one. And so if they're in charge, they're driving all of the global resources to live out this story, whether the rest of us want to participate in that or not.
that is
And
correct.
so it's just like, to me, we're really learning that most of what's going on is not for our benefit. It is we're living for the benefit of the small group of people who are trying to control resources and everything and don't really care if you live or die.
That's
And
right.
so, how then do we, as human beings in this collective humanity, say no? And I think there's, I mean, one that's kind of sowing the seeds of its own destruction, but I think we have a lot of infrastructure that if we did end up saying no, we've got a lot of things already laid down where we can begin to connect and say yes and create in different ways. Now, it'd probably be pretty messy. I like my way better, but
I mean, so this brings me back to my initial cynicism, which is I am absolutely amazed by how Mike Huckabee and a very small number of people, Pete Hegseth, and so on, how they can have, I mean, like you said, they're basically living out their fantasy. Now their fantasy happens to be
Mhm.
very destructive and so
Yeah.
on, but I mean, they're doing it. They're living it out. They're in a position, the power to basically make
They
it
are living.
happen. Like billions of people around the world are just kind of like, huh, what? Just sort of dealing with it. And I mean, I think part
Well,
of it
kinda held
is what's that? Wait, what's
right,
that?
held hostage by it. I mean, because individually we can't really do much, so we're kinda held hostage to this situations that we're in now. Some of us are watching it from afar, and some people are deep in it, so it's, all of that. But yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, the thing is I mean, it's like it's such a small number of people. I just don't get why you have these governments who were just like, well, is this legal? I don't know. Is it legal? Well, he says it's legal. We have to take this to court, blah, blah, blah. As opposed to, hell no.
Right, right.
No, we're not doing that. I just don't understand. It seems to me the only people who have like the gumption to actually just put their foot down are the people who want the bad things, where they're just like, no, I am going to, what the? They're like, "No, I'm going to take this. I'm going to invade this country. I'm going to do this." I mean, it seems as though that's the way that those are the people who have, the most influence, whereas the rest of the world is sort of, talking about meeting and meeting to talk and, just asking questions and just sort of accepting the completely bad faith arguments that people who have an agenda and they're just going to execute that agenda regardless. I mean, it just seems like the rest of the world is you can't meet an object that's going in one direction by talking about it. You're going to have to put a force in opposition to it to stop it. Period. That's just the way it is. You're not
Well,
going to
one
you're
of the
not going to convince them not to do what they want to do.
no, but I think one of the lessons that's coming from the Epstein files is how interconnected the power levers around the
That's true.
world actually are.
That is true. Yeah, people who you
And
would never
so
expect to know the
right.
same person, all knowing the same person very, very well. Yeah, that is true.
And all protecting one another and holding one another's interests above the interests of what they're, like, supposed to be or
Right.
elected to or whatever. And so one of the lessons of that for of the Epstein files is, how do you dismantle that? I mean, you dismantle it in part by bringing it to light and transparency. And then, if you begin to dismantle those connections, then and we understand what those connections are, then you can begin to dismantle power a little bit. But that was one of the great things not great things, great lessons coming out of that is all the hidden, like you said, network of power. Not necessarily the people who are the face of the power, but the interconnections of powerful people with powerful money, with being able to control systems, with being able to control, national and international law enforcement, and being able to hush up things. And when all of that is consolidated, as it was in the Epstein files, and as it is looking, as we're in these folly wars, that as we begin to see, like these things are not isolated incidents, they are all things that are working together in a particular kind of coordination with odd people as the face of that coordination, that you wouldn't let babysit your children. As we begin to see that and lose our reverence for power because we can see how it's being exploited and exploitative, I think that's where we're able to better say no.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I just feel like the only way that we're going to stop this train is a stubborn SOB is going to say, hell no, and just keep saying it over and over again, rally a bunch of people behind him or her, and then just do what needs to be done to stop them. That's what I personally believe.
And what is
I don't
their
think it's going to
incentive?
rise up. I'm sorry.
What is their incentive? And
Stubbornness.
how does that change anything? Because it just volleys it from one side to another side. So if somebody's coming up
That's true.
and
That is
saying
true.
no, then, I mean, if you look at our politics, right? It's always like this ping pong match from one side to another. And it's still mostly abuse of power on one side and abuse of power on the other side. And we just get tired of one side, so we vote for the other side, and it just goes back and forth, but it's still an abuse of power. It's
Well, we have
different kinds of
something,
power.
but we have something new now, though, because what we know now, because we have a person in power who doesn't care about institutions, what we know now is that if you are president of the United States, just implement your agenda. And
Mhm.
the other institutions will, I mean, they will complain, they'll bring you to court, and all this other kind of stuff. The difference is like in this particular case, the agenda is not popular. And so they're instituting an agenda that people are, they're constantly alienating this person here, this person there. So first it was people whose ancestors came from South America,
Mhm.
relatives came from South. First you alienate them. Now I'm seeing more and more media about like women, white women in particular, being alienated because
Yeah.
we have policies that are just like white women need to have more babies, like specifically.
Mhm.
And so, so you have all these women who were kind of on in this particular group are kind of going, whoa, 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 wait, what?
Yeah, yeah, now
And so
not right, like, now it's your rights on the talking block.
right, exactly. So now it's like, they're all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, I wasn't down with this. And so they're alienating more and more people to the point where they're going to shrink their support down to the most down to the most extreme zealots, basically.
Mhm,
Whereas you could do it another way. I mean, the same thing still stands to be true, which is an executive in this country could just do it. And
mhm.
then, people in Congress are going to have hearings and complain and do all this other kind of stuff, and you can even bring it up to Supreme Court. And if they're on your side, then they'll just basically say, well, my interpretation of whatever is, yeah, he can do what he wants. I like this
Right,
guy, so he
right,
can do what he wants or
right.
whatever. Or
That's
even if they
exactly it.
say,
Yeah.
I don't like this woman, she can't do what she wants. If she
Mhm,
ignores them, so what? Okay. It's like they disagree with her. So what? And so, I mean, that's just the reality that we now know for certain.
mhm.
That's something that we can speculate. Well, if the president just ignored Congress and the Supreme Court, there really isn't anything they can do about it. We know that for certain because it's happened. And so
Right,
now
so
it's
to
at the
your
point.
point so
Well,
so if
that
you had the person that came back who was really stubborn, who was gonna take down the current situation, they would have all of that foundation of new executive power to be able to do something of their own that might just do the same thing on the other side. So,
yeah, but it might be very popular. There are certain things that are actually um, not uh, uh, not partisan. I mean, they're not partisan at all. I mean, taxing billionaires is not a partisan issue.
no,
regardless
but
of what
they
regardless of
yeah,
what people say
right.
in response to YouTube shorts, it's not a partisan issue. It's a 80-20 issue. And I mean the same thing is true with so many things. And so if you have a person who runs with a steadfast commitment And
Mhm.
I can envision two specific things. Taxing billionaires is one.
Mhm.
If that person runs on that and basically makes it clear, I'm going to implement this, period.
Mhm.
And kind of acts as if the situation we're in now is true, which is Congress is irrelevant, the Supreme Court is irrelevant. I think that person would be hard to beat, to be honest with you. Now, I agree with you that is not a system that's great because
Uh-huh.
you're basically going to lurch from one, set of policies to the other. And it's not quite the same as before where we would lurch because at least people pretended that the
That's the
laws
thing, yeah,
mattered.
the gloves are off now, yeah.
Yeah, all the gloves are off now, and so, but at the same time, again, going back to what I was saying, the forces now are determined. They are determined. They're not necessarily organized because Christian nationalists and Christian Zionists don't agree. So they're not exactly organized, but they are determined.
Mhm.
They don't have to be in a majority to basically move things in a particular direction. I mean, we're
Yeah,
at war and
control the
people are
levels of
just
power. Yeah.
yeah, and people are like, I don't know, why are we at war? What do you mean, why are we at war? Look who's in charge.
Alright, so let me ask you a question. We're kind of at the top of our hour, and we haven't
Yeah, yeah,
circled
yeah.
back. Say your
Right.
determined, stubborn person got into control or into power. What or you, whatever. What are the inalienable rights of being human that you would like that did you would like to see honored in by that person or
Well,
that system?
basically, again, I love the idea. And one of the things to me is basically it's none of your damn business. So what you believe doesn't
Mhm,
have anything to do with how I live. Have you ever
mhm,
noticed? I mean, this is another thing. And again, I'm an ideological person, so I'm like emotional about this kind of stuff. But to me, it hasn't really seemed as though there've been, a red blue kind of divide. It seems to me the divide has actually been people who really care about other people's business and
mhm.
everybody else who just
Right,
doesn't want to be bothered.
yeah.
I mean, because it's like, why is it your business how this person dresses? Why is it your business who they, are partnered with? Why is it your business,
Mhm,
whether or not the government supports them or not? I mean, why is that your business? I just, and to me, that's the basic idea. And I think you can really cut through a lot of this BS
mhm,
just by basically saying, well, is this really your business? Is this woman's need to have an abortion really your business? No, it's
mhm.
not. It's not your business. And to me, that's it's simple. It's not really
Yeah,
complicated.
okay. And what else?
Or what else?
Yeah, because okay, so let's look at some of the other rights that people have talked about, because, I mean, people have asked me about American rights, and I'm like, "Well, your fundamental right in America is the right to fail," because we just don't have much of a safety net, and, there's not you can aspire all you want, but there's not much there that's gonna catch you,
Yeah, but
and
doesn't it strike you as odd how we can spend $1 billion a day bombing another country, but we don't
totally,
have much
yeah,
of a
no,
safety
totally.
net?
So yeah, no, I'm with you on that one. So, but what I'm looking at as inalienable human rights are things like, do we have a right to clean air? Do we have a right to clean water? Do we have a right to the things that we need in order to thrive? And do we have a right, we talk about healthcare, we talk about
Right.
these kinds of things, and within our current system, you only have the right to what you have the money to pay for. You don't
Yeah.
have any real rights, right? So,
Right.
when you're talking about inalienable rights, by virtue of being human,
Hmm.
what are those fundamental rights that we either have or we would like to see honored? Because I'm with you on it's nobody's business as long as you're
Hmm.
not hurting somebody. But that's not the highest law. I mean, I think that I look at more foundational rights, the rights of food and water and clean air and safety and community, and things like that versus
Well,
war.
actually, I think of those as second order because I mean, food is one thing, or water. Let's say water
Mhm,
is one thing, but clean water is another thing. I mean, water is just there, but the question of whether or not the water will be clean actually is connected to the question of whether or not you should have like a manufacturing plant up the river
mhm,
or just dumping chemicals into the
right,
water so that it comes downstream and dirties your water. I mean, so that's to me that's not a first order question. That's getting more into the complexity of governance today. But that's kind of where I was those are the type of issues I had in mind in terms of Well, going back to your imaginary world and your system, like how do you deal with those types of things in that system? It sounds like in that system, you're not going to have a manufacturing plant up the river dumping chemicals into the water.
Right, and I think yours like, our cause and effects are different. So, your cause and effect is if it's nobody's business that, of what you do, there's not gonna be or if you can't infringe upon somebody, there won't be, a manufacturing plant that's gonna dirty your clean water. And mine is, if clean water is an actual right, then the way that we organize our manufacturing would be to sustain and improve clean water. So it's a
I wish that we could assume that everybody would agree. If you watch cable news, people will say things like, "We can all agree that we should all have clean water." When the fact is that that's not something that we all agree about. And I see three categories at least. You have people like you who assume that clean water is a fundamental right. You have people who I'm not really convinced that they necessarily feel like water should be dirty. I mean, because that's just nonsensical. But they kind of feel like there's almost like their position is really in opposition to your position. You know what I'm
Mhm,
saying? So it's not like they think that water should be dirty. They just don't like your statement that clean water is a right, is a fundamental right. And
mhm,
then there's the bigger group of people. Well, what I think of as the biggest group of people are people who don't really see that is in the realm of governance, civics, politics. I mean, they react to whatever the consequences are on the ground. So if the water gets dirty and they start getting affected by it, then they react to that. But, it's very difficult to connect the future, whether or
mhm.
not the water is going to be clean or dirty, to a decision, a political decision today to that type of person. And I think that's actually the biggest group of
Well, and
people
that's the group that, that whole manufactured division is maintaining because it's all about reacting to what's happening in the moment
in the
versus
moment. Yeah,
how do
exactly.
we
Right.
look at, how
Yeah,
do we look at this,
exactly.
like, for me, from a system level?
Exactly.
Because you can't and that's one thing I really learned, like, during Hurricane Helene is a real appreciation even for our local systems and how, how the water system actually worked and how the water system worked here as connected to other water systems in the area and how,
Mhm.
all of the different systems have to work together in order to sustain anything. That you like, nothing is really in isolation, and we're not taught that, we don't really think about that, we're really react like you say, react to, "Well, this is a problem," like Flint, Michigan, this is the water in Flint is a problem, and there was this kinda corruption that created that problem, that's the only, place that it is, and we have to fight that problem, versus it being, a system of corruption and greed and really dismissing the importance of the water supply for people because of the community that they live in. And so it's not a system issue. It's oh, those people in Flint, Michigan did something bad and something's wrong. And it's not divorced from this is the incentive within the system to disregard clean water for people in different communities. We have a large group of people that react to things because it's right in their face and they haven't really looked at things from a holistic perspective. And you've got people who wanted like me who think clean water should be like a universal value and people who react against it because and I think they react against it because, "Oh, that's gonna cost me something. That's
I
gonna require I'm it's gonna use my tax dollars. It's gonna use it to give something to somebody else." And, we react to it on a resource level
I have a
rather
hard
than
time ascribing any kind of rationality to those people. They just seem to be curmudgeons, I swear. I really, I mean, they're always there. They're always there for whatever it is. They're always there for like, childcare for little babies or, and
Mhm.
children and universal pre-K. And, they're always there to oppose whatever it is. And to me, the rationality doesn't seem to have anything to do with it.
No,
Um,
that's true.
well, it was great talking to you, Christine, once again.
You too? You too? It always goes somewhere interesting.
We always do. We always do. And we do this every 2 weeks. I'm assuming,
Yep.
are you still available, do you think, 2 weeks from
Yep,
now,
yep.
3 o'clock? Okay. Every 2 weeks on Friday at 3 o'clock, we do this. I hope you guys thought this was interesting, whoever has been watching, and I hope you join us next time.
Absolutely.